Many Pennsylvania soldiers came from towns where patriotism ran high. The whole community backed the war effort, selling war bonds and gathering scrap for use in factories. More importantly, Pennsylvania powered the war effort with soldiers eager to fight. They left from Lock Haven, Altoona, and near Erie. Those who returned considered themselves the lucky ones.
Production funding provided by
providing insurance for farmers by farmers since 1913. ECM Insurance Group of Everett.
and by Homewood at Martinsburg, offering continuing care for seniors since 1932.
We want no war. We'll have no war, save in defense of our own people.
In the 1930s, when Congress passed a series of neutrality acts, most Americans wanted to stay out of international affairs. But as Germany and Japan aggressively annexed territory, support for isolationism began to erode. In 1939, Germany overran Poland.
Adolf Hitler's mechanized forces are racing toward Paris as French resistance collapses.
And quickly defeated France in 1940. The Nazis then forced Britain into a fierce battle for its survival.
Hello, America. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today than at any time since the war began.
It was so frightening to all of us to see Germany taking over country after country after country, and you knew something was going to happen.
As anti-war feeling began to fade, and Americans realized that they had to help out their allies, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941. This act gave President Franklin D. Roosevelt the power to sell, transfer, or lease war goods to countries whose defense was vital to Americans.
Ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
Before 1939, the U.S. had supplied Japan with natural resources and scrap metal for its industries. But when Japan continued hostilities against China despite warnings from the U.S., President Roosevelt cut off American exports to them. Japan then looked toward Southeast Asia for resources. What stood between Japan and its strategic expansion was the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor.
At 7:55 a.m., hell broke loose. Man-made hell, made in Japan.
Reactions to the attack at Pearl Harbor were swift.
The tone of the people changed, and it was, they can't do this to us, and we're going to get them. And how dare they undertake such a thing when we're so much more powerful than they are? That was the thinking at the time.
An hour and a half after I reported aboard ship, it was announced over the bullhorn, a state of war now exists between the United States and Japan. And about a half hour later, another announcement, a state of war now exists between the United States and Germany. So I have been able to say that Roosevelt waited until he knew I was aboard and ready to fight before declaring war on Japan and Germany.
Right after Pearl Harbor, I believe it was before Christmas, to my utter astonishment, I was invited over for a cup of tea by a faculty member, and she said, "Today we're going to have a serious talk about your immediate future. Would you be interested in being trained as a cryptanalyst?"
Both Norma Condi and her husband Ralph were recruited to work as code breakers. They had several months together in Washington before he was sent abroad.
While we were both working, we used to love to get together for lunch. And we used to, whenever we could, weather permitting, we would always walk over to the Lincoln Memorial and have our sandwiches over there, sitting on the steps, because why not? It was wonderful. It was a nice way to be together.
Jack McMillan came from a small town near Erie, Pennsylvania. where everybody knew everybody, and you had a whole community looking after you if you were a kid.
Well, in 41, I would have been 15 years old. We probably were as shocked as everybody else was in this country and didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was and weren't sure what that meant. We were about as patriotic as anybody could get. We went the whole way. We had our victory gardens. We collected pots and pans, anything metal that they could use in the factories.
The pots and pans and other metal were used as scrap to keep the factories running. In total war production, Pennsylvania ranked 7th among the states, provided almost 1/3 of the nation's steel, and was 3rd in the production of weapons systems. The location of munitions plants, like the one near Jack McMillan's town, was hush-hush.
It was a TNT plant, and it had Quonset huts, and a lot of stuff was underground. And they hired a lot of people from outside to build it, to put it together. But then it provided a lot of employment for the area.
In addition to the production of war goods, Pennsylvanians contributed their most precious asset, people. 7% of the armed forces came from Pennsylvania, for a total of 1.25 million Pennsylvanians. Patriotism was fueled by seeing friends go to war.
Not only were they in combat, and some of them had been killed, but they were joining at the ages of 16 and 17. Some of them lying about their age, but getting in nevertheless and getting over there into the fight.
Although they were close to the war, Jack McMillan and other young soldiers had no sense of their own mortality.
There was no way that we were going to die or get hurt in the service. It would be the other fellow. It would be somebody else.
When I was ready to leave Lock Haven for the service, my dad and mother was there, and my brother. But this one older fella, he put his arms around my shoulder and he said to my dad, he said, "Dad, don't worry about it." He says, "We'll take care of your little boy."
The wounded started going back 6 minutes after we hit the beach.
Despite the optimism of the young fighters, more than 400,000 Americans were killed in World War II. Over 26,000 of them from Pennsylvania. The U.S. began to build a large air force in Britain with which to launch attacks against Germany. The American strategy was to wear out the German war machine while building up our capacity to wage war. In January of 1942, the first American troops arrived in the British Isles. Caught on home movies, these members of the 8th Air Force ham it up between missions.
Three French pilots fly American-built planes for the RAF.
The Royal Air Force began an air offensive against the Germans in May of 1942. By July, American air crews joined them. In this government-produced newsreel, American, British, and French forces prepare for an eventual invasion of German-held territories in Europe.
No ground battery has more than an outside chance to score a hit. They are on a great aerial steeplechase, and the prize of the hunt is a factory.
In all our wars, no matter how heavy the odds against them, American soldiers were struck often and struck hard.
As the Allied Air Force struck German factories and transportation lines, American industry, including factories in Pennsylvania, geared up. Coal and steel towns held labor rallies to encourage the production of tanks, planes, and guns.
Worker for worker, American industries determined to meet the Axis challenge in the production plants.
America was also building up its officer corps.
Under simulated battle conditions, thousands of men learning every cunning, every trick.
I was at officer's cadet school for 3 months. In fact, everyone called us 90-day wonders because we were commissioned in 90 days.
Ads attracted men who enlisted.
Well, I wanted to be a naval aviator. I saw the ads in the paper and all, and heard them on the radio, and it sounded pretty glamorous to me, and so I thought, well, I'd give that a try.
In pursuit of the enemy, our Army and Navy airmen flew through storm and fog and hurricane, 1/5 on instruments, 4/5 on luck.
In the Pacific, operations spanned oceans, making communications of all kinds difficult. Families at home tuned in their big radio sets to hear the war news from far-off places.
And you could actually walk down the street and in nice weather, and you could hear Gabriel Heater talking about the war as you went from house to house.
Gabriel Heater was a radio commentator with a trademark welcome phrase, "Ah, yes, I've got good news tonight." Initially, the news was not good. Japan was sweeping over American forces on islands in the Pacific, including the Philippine Islands.
There were 3 boys at home, myself and 2 brothers, and we all went to war. My 2 brothers went in the Army, and I went in the Navy. So we left my mother without any male help. But I had no misgivings because I know my mother was praying for me all the time I was gone. In fact, she was praying for all the boys.
And they had newsreels. They had newsreels that brought you up to date on what was going on in the war front.
Produced by the War Department, the information provided to Pennsylvania moviegoers had a decided slant. The message was intended to motivate the home front to support the war effort.
This was our Navy when we entered the war. Many of these ships have since been sunk. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean.
Made with steel manufactured in Pennsylvania, replacement ships were built in Philadelphia and Chester shipyards and many other places on both coasts. The commander of the growing Navy fleet was Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. Stratford Smith, a Navy communications officer, encoded and decoded messages to and from the Admiral.
I was assigned to handle top secret communications, and that gave me an opportunity to be in the Admiral's office several times a day, delivering communications to him. I was so nervous during my first visit with him that when I tried to pick the cup up, I shook to the point that I spilled coffee. So I put it right back down again, and he kind of smiled and just told me to relax. And we got into talking about the messages.
Communications flowed from all commanders, American, German, and Japanese, in code. In 1942, the Japanese Navy sent a message that Ralph Condee's unit was able to break.
My husband was working on the Japanese code, and they decoded a message which said that there was going to be an attack on an American base in the Pacific. And of course, what American base?
The Japanese code identified the target of the attack only as AF.
Through their decoding, they figured out that Midway fit the description of AF.
To test their theory, naval intelligence arranged for American forces at Midway to send out a message that they were short of fresh water. Soon, the Americans intercepted a Japanese message that said, AF is running short of fresh water.
That told them what AF was, and Midway was ready for the attack when it came.
Meantime, our warships stalked the Jap fleet.
Admiral Nimitz sent these 3 carriers to lie in wait northeast of Midway Island.
Then suddenly, the trap is sprung. Navy planes roared from the decks of our carriers, Army bombers, Marines. The invasion forces were hit and hit and hit again.
In the attack, American aircraft sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and a cruiser. In addition, Japan lost numerous pilots. As a result, the Japanese fleet turned around. Even though the Americans won the battle, they sustained severe losses of aircraft and men. James Toothman was a radar officer aboard the Yorktown when a Japanese aerial torpedo hit the port side of the carrier. The captain gave the order to abandon ship, and the crew slid down large ropes that hung from the catwalks of the carrier about 30 feet long.
And I did very well until I got about 10 feet from the water, and then my grip was not sufficient to hold me, and I slid down too fast into the water and got some rope burns on my hands. So I survived the Battle of Midway with only rope burns on my hands as my injury, and no Purple Heart for that.
Toothman swam toward a circle of destroyers and cruisers that had formed to rescue the Yorktown crew in between bombing raids, and was picked up by the destroyer Anderson in the late afternoon. At Midway, the whole battle took place without a ship firing on another ship. A total air-to-sea battle, the encounter ushered in a new phase of naval warfare where battleships were largely obsolete.
It was the bravery of the pilots, particularly the dive bombers, that resulted in the sinking of 4 Japanese carriers, and this has been regarded as a turning point in the battle with Japan.
Presidential candidate? Channel swimmer? Movie star? It's a tech sergeant coming home to Pittsburgh on a furlough. That's his mother. Her sight is failing, but she can still pick out a greenback Kelly in a crowd.
Chuck Commando Kelly was one of 32 Pennsylvania soldiers awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. No other state matched this total. Kelly was awarded his medal after his actions near the Italian town of Altavilla in September of 1943.
By an official tally, Kelly had knocked out 40 Germans in less than an hour and had taken command first of a platoon and then of a company. So back home, they offered him downtown Pittsburgh on a platter, but he said no thanks.
2 years of war have also changed Kelly's hometown, Pittsburgh.
Open the door at any shop or a mill and you could see the change yourself. Castings for washing machines, automobiles, girders, been changed to castings for 155s. Kelly had seen these guns in action. He remembered the good feeling it gave him to know that the artillery was there.
Kelly was the first serviceman given a Medal of Honor in the European theater, part of the Allies' capture of Sicily and the invasion of Italy.
Give him hell when you get back.
I sure will. There, far below this plane, down on that Italian beach, is the landing fleet of the American Fifth Army.
Following the fall of Sicily, the Germans took over Italian defensive positions and stiffly defended the beaches near Salerno.
The objective was to take Rome, not in a week or a month, not on any given date, but take Rome with the smallest loss of life.
In fact, it took 8 months to take Rome, and losses were considerable.
Our friends at home must not suppose from these victories that the road to Rome or the road to Berlin will be easily or quickly passed. We face a desperate enemy who fights like a cornered rat. We will beat him, but not without bitter struggles and heavy sacrifices.
On June 4th, 1944, the Allies finally entered Rome. It was only 2 days before the invasion of Normandy in France. For those at home opposed to war on religious or ethical grounds, Congress made provision for ways to serve that did not include fighting. In Pennsylvania, over 1,000 conscientious objectors, 1/3 of them from Lancaster County, were assigned to civilian public service. Nationwide, conscientious objectors fought forest fires, worked as medics in the battlefield, and built conservation projects.
Well, we were building small tenant houses in the Missouri Valley bottomland there of the Missouri River and trying to develop the area for agriculture.
Conscientious objectors also volunteered for scientific experiments designed to improve living conditions for soldiers.
Well, they also serve who only stand and scratch was what Time magazine labeled the project that we were volunteers for. There were about 30 of us volunteered for what was called a typhus control experiment, which meant giving a patch of sewed on the inside of our underwear containing 100 laboratory-bred lice.
Lice can carry typhus. The government was testing which of several powders would kill lice most effectively.
Well, there was kind of fun contest as to who had the most lice after one night's sleep and the next morning. And some guy was almost in disgrace for only having 6 lice left in the morning when he got up.
Experiments like these were designed to help soldiers like Joel Holcomb, who fought in the South Pacific, first in Guadalcanal and then in New Guinea. In the hot, humid conditions there, soldiers struggled with diseases, often fighting racked by chills and fever. An Army history claims that for every 2 soldiers lost in battle, 5 were lost to disease: typhus, malaria, dengue, dysentery.
We took all kinds of shots on the ship while we were going overseas. We had to line up, and I remember some of the soldiers sort of passing out from getting the shots. They didn't like the shots, you know.
Almost all of the soldiers suffered from ulcers caused by skin disease, affectionately known as jungle rot.
I'm sorry, but I remember one of my friends had jungle rot in his private parts. And so one of the entertainers that came overseas to entertain the troops was going through the hospital. And they said, "What's wrong with you, soldier?" He blushed really and said, "Oh, I just have jungle rot." We did have a lot of entertainers come over and entertain the troops, which was it did a lot for the morale of the troops, really. I know Francis Langford sang songs of the time, the big band songs. All of them reminded of the troops of home. Yeah.
I'm always chasing rainbows, watching clouds drifting by.
Soldiers did their best to stay connected to those at home.
Yes, I did write home. They had V-mails, I believe is what they call them. And I would write home probably once a month and tell them what's going on within the security limits that we had. And also the officers were responsible for checking the mail to the troops to see that they didn't send any classified information home.
What is it like for parents to have 4 children all involved in combat operations and no way of knowing what their circumstance was at any given time because of close secrecy?
Underfield, letter from Brandywine, Maryland.
Before I went overseas, we had made a list of the countries, and I would use a phrase for each one. They knew where I was all the time.
By night and by day, by air, sea, and land, with task forces of gigantic size and power, we...
Following victories in the Coral Sea and at Midway, in late 1942 the Americans began ground offensives in the jungles of the Solomons and in New Guinea.
Raid on Wewak, New Guinea. A surprise attack at Jap Pearl Harbor.
That's one of our P-38 Lightnings. Its motor on fire. Our pilot is coming down on his silk. This is the moment for which trained, sensitive hands back home cut and stitch that parachute.
A dive bomber pilot from Orwigsburg, Pennsylvania, Joe Eisenhuth won the Navy Cross for his bravery in the Pacific. His squadron operated out of Guadalcanal.
Guadalcanal was a lovely place. Every kind of disease known to man there. As a squadron, when our air group would fly up the what they called the slot between all the islands all the way up to Bougainville and bomb various facilities and airfields, whatever.
Ever been on a dive bombing mission? You're on one now.
The essence of dive bombing was the same, whether the targets were in the Pacific, where Joe Eisenhuth was stationed, or in Europe, where these pilots flew.
You'd try to get on the target as quickly as you could, and you'd have dive flaps opened up so that you wouldn't go down too fast. Then at a prescribed altitude, usually somewhere around 1,500 feet to 1,000 feet, you'd release your bomb and do a pull-out, and then kick the plane all over the sky so that they couldn't get a bead on you to shoot you down.
Don't mind if these pictures wobble, we're dodging flak.
You could see them shooting at you. The little tracers would come up, and there's 6 of us that were in that first air group that were transferred to a second air group together. One of the 6 was shot down on our first combat after we went out on a carrier, and he was shot down over Iwo Jima, and so there were only 5 of us left, but those 5 lasted through the whole war.
After their successes in the Solomons and New Guinea, MacArthur and Nimitz launched converging offensives toward the islands of Japan. MacArthur would head across New Guinea to the Philippines, and Nimitz would island hop across the Central Pacific. Their strategy depended on amphibious warfare and supporting air power.
Every Marine in the outfit.
Beyond the jungles lay atolls, ring-like coral islands.
We were going out to take Beisio Island, he to an atoll called Tarawa.
In November of 1943, Nimitz began his island-hopping campaign.
The first battle that we were engaged in was the battle for Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. Our fighter planes were used to strafe the enemy.
Our Army and Navy planes had been pacing the island for 5 days, and it didn't seem as though anyone on Beisio could have lived through the bomb. The Navy pumped 2,800 tons of steel from Pennsylvania and Alabama in.
At Tarawa, dug-in Japanese artillery pounded incoming amphibious landing craft caught on coral reefs offshore.
The Japs began to get the range of the Higgins boat snagged on the reefs. We had to get out and wade 400 yards through terrific crossfire. A few minutes after the landing, when the guys were hugging the beach, that piece of beach was all we had. That was our line for the rest of the day. The camera tells the truth, but it doesn't give you any idea of how it smelled.
We were so close to the island, and the heat was so great that we could smell the death smell of flesh coming from the island. The wind was blowing it from the island. We could smell it.
We lost more than 1,000 dead and more than 2,000 wounded. Stretcher bearers loaded the wounded onto rubber rafts and pushed them out to the Higgins boats off the reef.
And then when we left there and came back, we brought back many of the wounded. And so many of them were shot through the eye. Unusually, I was amazed at the number of men who got shot through the eye.
Japanese snipers had easily picked off Americans as they tried to come ashore. Nimitz and MacArthur had overestimated their ability to rout the dug-in Japanese. In the future, the Americans would bypass strongly held islands and strike at weaker enemy outposts as they pushed toward Japan in 1944.
Almost immediately, Seabees were working on the 2 bomber strips on the island, and on the 4th day after we struck, Tarawa began to function as an advanced air base.
Pennsylvania's own 28th Infantry Division shipped out to the British Isles in October of 1943 and settled in South Wales. Over the next 9 months, they trained in preparation for D-Day.
Out to sea now. Our men have been told the nature of the job ahead of them.
Paul Russell, a Navy enlisted man from Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, was a gunner and ammunition loader during the D-Day invasion.
We were to shoot down any airplanes that were attacking small boats or anything inside the wave going in. And we had to follow every wave in. But on our first wave, USF 31 was sunk. I lost quite a few friends on that one. It was 65 men on a 165-foot landing craft. So we knew each other pretty well. But then we kept going out and picking up another wave coming in. We did that all day. They dropped a bomb beside our craft, and it just raised the craft right up, and we slept in hammocks. And they just rolled us right out of the hammocks. But from then on, I think I slept on topside. It was safer.
Although Paul Russell had a busy day on June 6, 1944, he had no planes to shoot at.
One gunner on the bow with a 20 millimeter, he left some of them ripped to go. And of course he got the devil for it, because the skipper didn't tell him to fire. But that's the only time we shot any shots, because we didn't have the aircraft to shoot at. The Air Force had them just about licked right there.
Down there in the rubble, a Yank is leaving town, moving on with the rest of the war. This boy, not far from playing cops and robbers in the streets of home, played a different game in the streets of Cherbourg. The cities of Normandy are quiet now. The battle's moved on.
In fact, the cities were not quiet. It took a month for the Americans to advance in Normandy against a strong German defense. As part of that offensive, Pennsylvania's 28th Division saw action for the first time, July 22, 1944, and battled in the hedgerows of Normandy for a month.
This airfield was captured from Hermann Goering's team.
Once the Allies had secured parts of southern Italy, planes could take off from American-built airstrips to bomb Axis factories and refineries in the Balkans. Earl Kessler arrived in San Pancrazio, Italy, just 6 days after D-Day. He flew into combat the next day as the navigator of a B-24 bomber. The crew's mission was to bomb oil fields in German-occupied Hungary. On an early flight, a tire blew out on takeoff.
The thing was heavily loaded with gasoline and bombs. We managed to get airborne and went on the mission. And we came back not very sure about what we were going to do. We couldn't get back up to elevation because one engine was on fire and we just couldn't climb anymore. But we could fly around. They had us circle until the gasoline was about all finished and until other crippled airplanes had time to get in to safety. And our pilot declared he could do it. And so he and the co-pilot, by almost a superhuman effort, did land the plane on the one wheel. It was a tricycle landing gear, that is a nose wheel and then 2 wheels back under the wings. he set it down on that one wheel, and they managed to hold it up until the airspeed had declined markedly, and then it went down, the wing went down, and it plowed into the ground. All of us got out of it. We were all quite glad.
Sometimes we don't come back all in one piece.
Crash landings like these were common.
But we'll get her flying again.
On Earl Kessler's 8th mission, he was not so lucky.
We were hit just after the bombs left the plane. The plane flew on for a second or two, and in the meantime, the nose turret gunner had come boiling back out of his turret, and he and I were busy getting our chute snapped on. And I started to jump, but then the plane seemed to explode. We were trapped in that nose section, and he was struggling. And I managed to help him get free, get loose, but it had me pinned. I could not get loose. I sort of relaxed, and I don't know why, but it tossed me free. The next moment I looked down, and the ground was rushing up at me, so I managed to get the chute open. It seemed like an eternity before it came snaking out, and it was almost too late. I did 1 or 2 pendulum-type swings and put my feet down on a small building. And at about that time, I realized, oops, I'd been hit in the legs. There was noise, tremendous noise all around. Those small bombs were all around me, and they were still exploding. And from the appearance of the wounds, they were both from the back and upward and outward, so apparently I was hit from the rear by one of our own bombs.
Earl Kessler was captured by Hungarian soldiers and taken to a Belgrade hospital. His leg injury grew worse, and one Saturday evening, the nurses called in a doctor.
He came in evening clothes. He'd been at a formal dinner somewhere. I apologized for making him break away, and his response was, "Think nothing of it, I'm a doctor." And he worked with me for an hour or so there. He cleaned the wound, opened the cast, gave me some sulfa, and that was a turning point. So from thence on, he sort of protected me. When they would come in to take people off to the prison camps, he would tell them, "No, not Kessler, he has an infection," which I did have. I brought it home with me, but nevertheless, I'm very sure that had not been for his actions there, I wouldn't have made it.
Finally, when Earl Kessler was well enough, the Germans moved him to a prison camp. Early on, he asked a fellow prisoner about the key to survival.
He says, the German mentality respects the person who is a soldier. He says, don't ever forget to maintain your self as a soldier. Keep a stiff upper lip and keep a proper military decorum. I tried to do it. At prison camp, I was called in for interview, routine, by a German captain, and I reported to him just as I would have to a captain in this country. He almost seemed startled, but he returned the salute and invited me to sit down, and after the interview, he pushed his chair back and he says, "Let me ask you a few personal questions. You don't have to answer them." But he says, "I'd like to know what you did before the war." I said, "I was a student." And he asked a couple more questions. What curriculum were you in and stuff? And then with a sad look on his face, he says, "And I was a prof." And he seemed to be genuinely sorry about it. The guy remembered me. He came to the compound a time or two and stopped to say hello.
The prisoners were treated severely but fairly. Food was scarce.
The Germans told us, and we believed them, that they had very little food on their own. So we were down to about 600 calories for a while.
To irritate their captors, the prisoners in the camp started a rumor that they were going to be liberated on Easter. Some of them packed up their gear and placed it near the gates, ready to go. Even though that turned out to be a hoax, the prisoners managed to put on a feast for their Easter dinner.
And I suppose the menu must be here. Yeah, we had hors d'oeuvres. We had cabbage salad. which was just chopped up cabbage, that's all. And we had Spam a la carte with cheese. There was some cheese in the Red Cross parcels, and we had some mashed turnips and some cake, which was made out of probably some peanut butter and maybe a little bit of sugar that was in one of the Red Cross parcels. We ate and ate, and then we all got sick because our stomachs just couldn't take it. But it was fun anyhow.
As Americans pressed toward Japan, the armed forces engaged in all-out assaults.
There's nothing like a big gun invasion of an island to see explosions. To me, they were just another form of fireworks. Every 4th of July, we saved all year to send away to a little town in Ohio to get a display of fireworks, and the 12-year-olds, 13, 14-year-old, 15-year-old kids set them off. So to me, this was just another bigger version of that.
Our landing parties flowed ashore, backed up by material made in who knows how many American cities.
On July 21st, 1944, the Allies reclaimed Guam, American territory captured on December 10th, 1941, a few days after Pearl Harbor.
We were coming back, and we were making no secret about it. Our men were proud of this job, for they knew they were going to free not another exotic Pacific shore, but an American outpost, built and lived in by Americans, and for which fellow Americans had sacrificed their lives. Our dive bombers zoomed overhead, neutralizing Jap installations.
Doing the kind of work I did, flying on that, you didn't get to see a lot of the real horrors of war. It was sort of a clean thing. You went out and if a guy was shot down, he just didn't come back, and you didn't see exactly what happened. The toughest things is when the carrier was hit and you see the guys that are really hurt.
In October of 1944, General Douglas MacArthur and his 6th Army landed in the central Philippines on Leyte Island. The Japanese responded with a desperate measure: kamikaze attacks, suicide missions flown by young, half-trained pilots that sometimes targeted aircraft carriers.
Our radio rooms were right below the flight deck, and this one went right through our radio room and just rolled up the deck just like a carpet. One pilot, he was a little late in leaving the radio room, and he was just going down a ladder when the thing hit, and it blew him right back up the ladder and tore part of his leg away, and a couple of our gunners were lost. The hangar deck was just like a raging inferno. All the gasoline and planes there were ablaze, and it was a pretty sobering scene.
On August 29, 1944, Pennsylvania's 28th Division entered Paris and paraded across the city. After they crossed Belgium and Luxembourg, they were the first division to enter Germany in force in September. By November, they had suffered heavy losses in the Hürtgen Forest. Pennsylvania colleges, including Penn State, trained more than 60,000 sailors and soldiers, including ROTC officers like Ray Fortunato.
When I finished OCS, which was in April of 44, and I was 21 years old, I was sent to Camp Pickett, which was a training division at that time, the 78th Division. And we sailed in September of 44, and we went to England for a few weeks, then over into France, and up through France until we got to the edge of Germany. Now, after D-Day, the American troops advanced very quickly across France, but then they got stymied when they got to the German border. So we relieved seasoned troops who knew better than to jump off into the Hurtgen Forest because the Germans were so fierce in that particular area.
Ray Fortunato and his men were replacements for multiple divisions that had already been cut down in battle in the Hurtgen Forest. He entered combat on December 13th, 1944.
In our first attack, I was wounded. We attacked across an open field, and there were several pillboxes, German gun emplacements. And I was hit and fell and didn't realize where I was wounded until I reached down and saw some blood. And I happened to have the crotch of my trousers that have 4 bullet holes in it, which is the extent of my wound. And I was out in that field in a wounded situation for several hours, and then finally crawled back to the edge of the town about 400 or 500 yards and got into an aid station.
Ray Fortunato was not wounded seriously enough to be sent home. After returning to action, he and a couple of his men drove their jeep into enemy territory to gather intelligence, and were ambushed. He tried to escape, but got caught in some underbrush.
And then I heard the Germans talking up on the road, and I understood a little German, and they sent a German soldier down to find me. I thought I was going to be captured. And I had a pocket full of German iron crosses and other medals that I had taken from prisoners. So I got rid of those and buried them. I didn't want to be captured with those. I also happened to have a German pistol on me, and I hid that because I didn't want to be captured with it. And I was lying on the steep embankment, face down, holding onto the stump of a bush, when the German came down, stood right next to me. I could have reached out and touched his ankles. And I assumed I was going to be captured. Instead, he cocked his gun, a machine gun, and fired. And I literally wondered what the bullets were going to feel like. But he fired right next to me. I think he had had enough of the war. There was no question he saw me. He just he wanted to stop killing.
And that's where my great luck started. The Battle of the Bulge came, and we were told to get ready to ship out. I was in G Company, the 262nd Infantry, and we were loading on ships, but ahead of us was F Company, and the F Company first sergeant had overlooked the fact that he needed the company roster in order to get on the ship. So he had to go back to his duffel bag to get the roster. And to save time, they passed G Company around F Company. Well, sad for them, they went into the bottom of the ship, the hold of the ship, where we were supposed to go. And all of F Company, except for 3 men, were lost in a submarine attack.
When German forces counterattacked in Belgium in December of 1944, Pennsylvania's 28th Division could not hold its ground under severe tank and artillery fire. Suffering many casualties in the Ardennes, the soldiers retreated to the west until reinforcements and replacements stemmed the Nazi advance. Virgil Crowley's 69th Infantry Division first went into combat on February 12, 1945, as replacement troops at the Siegfried Line.
We went in to our positions about 4 o'clock in the evening, and it was kind of dark, and you thought you were in a thunderstorm because the artillery was so heavy. The sky was bright all the time with flashes as they were firing artillery. The noise was kind of deafening.
By mid-March, Virgil Crowley's regiment, the 273rd, was pushing toward the Rhine River and Berlin. Along the way, the infantry stayed in huge concrete bunkers.
There were commotion. We had guards outside, but there were also livestock outside wandering around. And the guards were always hearing these noises, and they thought it was the enemy coming in, and actually it was the livestock. One evening, this guard came running in, and he said to our top sergeant, Sarge, there's people outside. There's enemy outside. And we had one young fellow that was sleeping in the bunk inside, and Sarge woke him up and said, you go with him. And the kid looked up and said, he found them, let him go.
After the Battle of the Bulge, Pennsylvania's 28th Division joined the 7th Army, capturing Colmar in 1945. They crossed the Rhine before the Germans surrendered. In late April of 1945, just before the war ended, Virgil Crowley's 273rd Regiment was in a fierce battle at Leipzig, Germany.
We went in, embarked on high ground, went down. There was a small stream, and then there were hills, bluffs almost. And you had to get up those to get to where the Germans was well fortified. And we lost out of 270-some men, we lost about 160 in that one engagement. So some of my best friends were caught in that. In this last battle that we were in, being the chief of communications, I had to try to communicate with some of the guys in the front and some in the back. And so we were going up this hillside, and there were snipers all over the place. And the closest I came to actually getting wounded, they shot the ammunition belt off. I was wearing an ammunition belt, and they cut it off with a rifle bullet. So you keep your fingers crossed and you're lucky.
There wasn't anything that we needed that we didn't get from America. And we know that with the shortage of steel and oil in Japan, that they were scraping for everything they got.
The Germans were short on ammunition, so they would only fire when they got ammunition supplies replenished, which really wasn't very often, and we had lots of it, so we fired pretty regularly.
The war ended in Europe in early May 1945. Ray Fortunato celebrated with his commanding officer.
My commanding officer was the son of the commanding general at Pearl Harbor, and he was a terrific officer. He and I opened a bottle and finished it off that day. That was the way we celebrated VE Day.
Word sort of filtered down through. It didn't come immediately to us, but when it did, everybody was relieved. And then you started counting points because you came home on the basis of points you'd acquired. And if you had enough points, you were sent to a division that was coming home.
The Emperor of Japan gave his surrender speech on August 15, 1945, followed by Japan's official surrender on September 2nd.
On land and sea and in the air, American men and women have given their lives so that this day of ultimate victory might come and assure the survival of a civilized world.
It was broadcast over the Army radio. Everybody was shooting off their guns, you know, and really living it up because everybody was looking forward to going home.
When soldiers arrived home, their families could tell they had changed. They had traveled beyond small Pennsylvania towns to places all over the world. They had seen some sights they would prefer to forget.
I can remember when we first went in, and it was winter, of course cold. We went up to the front lines, and we're going through this country in France, and you see these stacks, and I thought, gee, they've got a lot of cordwood stacked up here. Turned out it was not cordwood, it was bodies of service people. They just hadn't had time to recover them, and they stacked them up like a cordwood.
They had also seen some sights that they would choose to remember. From the top of a battleship, Stratford Smith watched as the Sanctuary, a hospital ship, brought several hundred Allied prisoners of war out of Japan to go home.
And I saw the other ship coming down directly to pass us, and as it got close to us, the captain said, "Hip, hip," and then everybody shouted, "Hooray!" On the other ship, "Hip, hip, hooray!" And we did that 3 times.
Incidentally, none of us were heroes. We were all scared to death most of the time. But we all had an obligation to do our best for the rest of the soldiers we were with. That's what we did.
I think World War II has to be signified by basically what happened to the people when they came home. They carried on just like they would have if there'd been no war, except they had seen the world.
To these weary soldiers, Europe and the Pacific were no longer far-off exotic places. The sound of guns and artillery and bombs was all too familiar. And some friends had been lost forever. But now that the fighting was over, it was time to get back to life, to get a job, go to school, start a family. After all, they were the lucky ones.
Production funding was provided by
providing insurance for farmers by farmers since 1913. ECM Insurance Group of Everett.